October 1812. The Russian Steppe. The temperature has dropped to -20 degrees Celsius. The ground is iron. The wind comes from Siberia, and it cuts through a man like a bayonet. And through this frozen hell march the ruins of the greatest army the world has ever seen. These men were, just months ago, the soldiers of the Grande Armée, Napoleon's invincibles, the men who had humiliated Austria, crushed Prussia, and made the kings of Europe tremble at the sound of their boots. Now they are walking corpses. Behind them, in the distance, Moscow is still burning. And somewhere in the middle of this catastrophe, riding in a carriage wrapped in furs, staring out at his dying empire, is Napoleon Bonaparte, the most powerful man in the history of the modern world, brought to his knees by one decision. This is that story. To understand the catastrophe, you have to first understand the miracle, because what Napoleon Bonaparte built between 1804 and 1811 was nothing short of impossible. He was not born into greatness. He was born in Corsica, a small Mediterranean island that had just been sold by the Republic of Genoa to France the year before his birth. 1769. His family was minor nobility, but only barely. He spoke French with a foreign accent for most of his early life. And yet, by 35 years old, he had crowned himself Emperor of the French in Notre Dame Cathedral, placed the laurel on his own head, refusing to let the Pope do it, and looked out over the congregation with eyes that said, "I answer to no one." Let that sink in for a moment. In 1805, he shattered the combined armies of Austria and Russia at the Battle of Austerlitz. It is still studied in military academies today as close to a perfect battle as has ever been fought. In a single afternoon, in the fog of a December morning at Moravia, Napoleon feigned weakness on his right flank, lured the Allied forces into attacking it, and then, like a trap snapping shut, he struck the weakened Allied center with devastating force. The battle lasted less than 9 hours. The Third Coalition ceased to exist. In 1806, he crushed Prussia at the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt. A nation that had once been feared across Europe, dismantled in a single afternoon. Napoleon rode into Berlin 16 days later. 16 days. He visited the tomb of Frederick the Great and reportedly said to his generals, "Hats off, gentlemen. If he were alive, we would not be here." Even in victory, he understood history. By 1810, the French Empire directly controlled or dominated nearly the entire European continent. France itself, the Italian states, the Netherlands, Spain, the Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of German states essentially serving as French client kingdoms. His brothers sat on the thrones of Holland, Westphalia, Naples, and Spain. His brother-in-law, Joachim Murat, was king of Naples. His stepson commanded armies. His marshals, Ney, Davout, Soult, Massena, were the finest military commanders on earth. The population under direct French control or influence exceeded 80 million people. The entire British Empire, the global superpower of the era, had fewer than 20 million subjects in the British Isles. Napoleon had reshaped law with the Napoleonic Code, which is still the legal foundation of France, Louisiana, Quebec, and dozens of nations today. He had built roads, modernized the banking system, reorganized education. He was not just a conqueror, he was a civilization builder. And then, he made one decision that unraveled everything. To understand why Napoleon invaded Russia, you need to understand his one great strategic weakness: Britain. Britain had never been defeated. Surrounded by the English Channel, protected by the Royal Navy, the greatest naval force on earth, Britain was the one enemy Napoleon could not reach with his armies. And Britain funded every coalition that rose against him. British gold paid for Austrian soldiers, Prussian soldiers, Russian soldiers. As long as Britain stood, Napoleon's empire was never truly safe. So he devised another strategy: the continental system, A total economic blockade. Every nation in Europe, every single one, would be forbidden from trading with Britain. Choke off British commerce. Bankrupt the British economy. Force London to the negotiating table without ever firing a shot across the Channel. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it was fracturing. Russia was the problem. Tsar Alexander I had signed the Treaty of Tilsit with Napoleon in 1807, supposedly aligning Russia with France. The two emperors had met on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River and signed what was supposed to be a lasting peace. But the continental system was destroying the Russian economy. Russian nobles and merchants depended on trade with Britain, grain, timber, luxury goods. By 1810, Alexander had quietly begun allowing British ships into Russian ports under neutral flags. He was breaking the blockade, and Napoleon knew it. Here is where history turns. Napoleon convinced himself that Russia needed to be disciplined, that a swift, decisive campaign, like Austerlitz, like Jena, would force Alexander back into line. He believed Russia would fight one decisive battle, lose, and capitulate. He had done it before, to everyone. Why should Russia be any different? His advisors warned him. His most trusted marshals warned him. Marshal Berthier, his chief of staff, reportedly grew pale when shown the invasion plan. Caulaincourt, the French ambassador to Russia, had lived in Russia. He knew the land. He knew the winters. He pleaded with Napoleon personally, telling him, in words that should have stopped everything, that the Russian climate will fight for Russia. Napoleon dismissed him. General Armand de Caulaincourt later wrote in his memoirs that Napoleon had an answer for every concern, a rebuttal for every warning. His confidence had become something beyond confidence. It had become arrogance. And arrogance is just hubris with better press. On June 24, 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte crossed the Niemen River into Russia. With him, 685,000 men, the largest invasion force in the history of warfare up to that point. He was so certain of victory, he brought theatrical costumes and wine for the victory banquet he planned to hold in Moscow. He would never hold that banquet. The Russians did not stand and fight. This was the first sign that something was profoundly wrong. Napoleon had expected a decisive engagement near the border. He had planned to smash the Russian army in the opening weeks, as he had smashed every other army, and dictate terms from a position of total dominance. But the Russian generals, particularly Mikhail Barclay de Tolly, refused to give him what he wanted. They retreated, and retreated, and retreated. The Russians burned their own crops. They poisoned their own wells. They drove their own livestock away. They left nothing for the invaders to consume. 685,000 men need an unimaginable quantity of food, water, and fodder for their horses every single day. Napoleon's supply lines, already stretched thin across hundreds of miles of Russian territory, were beginning to break down. Men began to die, not from Russian bullets, but from exhaustion, dysentery, and hunger. And it was still summer. On September 7, 1812, the battle Napoleon had been waiting for finally came. Borodino. 70 miles west of Moscow, the Russian general Kutuzov turned and stood his ground. What followed was the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars, perhaps the bloodiest single day in all of European history up to that point. 70,000 casualties. In one day. French and Russian blood soaking the same ground. Napoleon won the field. Technically? But Kutuzov withdrew in good order. His army remained intact. It had not been destroyed. And Napoleon, who by this point was suffering from a severe cold and possibly the beginning of the illness that would plague him for years, failed to commit his imperial guard for the killing blow. For the first time in his military life, Napoleon hesitated when it mattered most. 1 week later, on September 14, 1812, Napoleon rode into Moscow, and the city was empty, not evacuated in a panic, deliberately abandoned. On the orders of Governor Fyodor Rostopchin, the Russian authorities had evacuated over 200,000 citizens. The city Napoleon had crossed a continent to reach was a ghost town. And then it started to burn. Whether set by Russian agents or by accident, by September 15th, the fires were out of control. 3/4 of Moscow burned over the next several days. The warehouses Napoleon needed for supplies, gone. The shelter he needed for his army, gone. The symbol of Russian civilization he had hoped to leverage as a bargaining chip, reduced to ash. Napoleon stood at the Kremlin and watched his strategy burn with the city. He waited for Alexander to negotiate. Alexander never came. For 35 days Napoleon waited in the ruins of Moscow. 35 days of sending peace overtures to the Tsar. 35 days of silence from St. Petersburg. The temperature began to drop. And on October 19th, with winter closing in, with his army starving in the ruins of a burned city, with no negotiation coming and no victory in sight, Napoleon ordered the retreat. What followed was not a retreat. It was an apocalypse. The temperature dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. -30. Flesh froze in minutes. Horses died in their traces. Men who fell asleep in the snow simply did not wake up. The Russians harassed the retreating army constantly, not with pitched battles, but with Cossack cavalry striking from the flanks, cutting off stragglers, destroying supply convoys. At the Berezina River crossing in late November, with Russian armies closing in from multiple directions, what remained of the Grande Armée barely escaped total annihilation. The bridges were built under enemy fire by French combat engineers who stood chest-deep in the freezing river to plant the supports. The engineers who built those bridges died doing it. Most of them drowned or froze. 685,000 men had entered Russia. By the time the remnants crossed back over the Niemen in December 1812, less than 100,000 remained. 100,000 survivors. Out of nearly 700,000, the greatest army ever assembled had been swallowed by Russia. The moment word reached Europe that the Grande Armée had been destroyed, the wolves came. Prussia, which had been humiliated in 1806 and forced into subservience, declared war on France in February 1813. Austria, Napoleon's most persistent enemy, whose Emperor Franz was, by this point, Napoleon's own father-in-law, abandoned its alliance and joined the coalition in August. Sweden, Russia, Britain, Prussia, Austria, the Sixth Coalition. Napoleon, astonishingly, still won battles. Even in 1813, even with a rebuilt army of largely raw conscripts, he defeated Allied forces at Lutzen, at Bautzen, at Dresden. His genius had not entirely deserted him, but genius requires resources. And France was exhausted. The nation had been at war, almost continuously, for 20 years. The young men were gone, dead in Russia, dead in Spain, dead in a dozen campaigns across a dozen countries. Napoleon was now conscripting teenagers, boys who had never held a musket. In October 1813, the decisive blow fell. Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations. For 3 days, from October 16th to 19th, over 500,000 men clashed around the city of Leipzig in Saxony, the largest land battle in European history before the First World War. Napoleon was outnumbered more than 2-1. He lost. The French army retreated across the Rhine. The Confederation of the Rhine, Napoleon's German buffer zone, dissolved overnight. The client kingdoms of Germany evaporated. Jerome Bonaparte fled Westphalia. The Italian states began to fall. The empire Napoleon had spent 15 years building was collapsing in real time. The Allies invaded France itself in January 1814. Napoleon fought them brilliantly. The 6 Days Campaign of February 1814 is considered one of his finest displays of operational genius, winning 4 battles in 6 days with a tiny, exhausted army. Military historians still marvel at it. But it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. On April 11th, 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte abdicated the throne of France. He was exiled to the island of Elba, off the coast of Italy. A tiny island, 11,000 people, a man who had ruled 80 million. He escaped, of course, because he was Napoleon. In March 1815, he landed in southern France with 1,000 men, marched north, and armies sent to arrest him, defected to him instead. He reclaimed Paris without firing a shot. The 100 Days. But the Allies mobilized immediately. And on June 18, 1815, on a muddy Belgian field near a small village called Waterloo, it ended. The Duke of Wellington held the French assaults through a grinding, brutal day of fighting. And in the evening, the Prussians arrived. Blucher's army, which Napoleon had believed neutralized. They hadn't been. The Old Guard, Napoleon's most elite soldiers, who had never broken in battle, who had never retreated, was shattered. And for the first time in their history, they ran. Napoleon was exiled a second time, to St. Helena, a volcanic rock in the South Atlantic, 1,500 miles from the nearest continent. He died there in 1821, 51 years old. The First French Empire was over. So why does any of this matter? Why are we still talking 2 centuries later about a Corsican general who built an empire and lost it in the snow? Because Napoleon's story is not just history, it is a warning. Think about what the Russian campaign actually represented. It was not the result of bad intelligence, though the intelligence was bad. It was not the result of poor planning, though the planning was inadequate. It was not bad luck. It was the inevitable consequence of a man who had succeeded so many times, in so many impossible situations, that he had lost the ability to hear the word no. Caulaincourt warned him. His marshals warned him. History itself had warned him. The Swedes under Charles XII had attempted to conquer Russia a century earlier and been destroyed. Napoleon knew this story. He had read it. He invaded anyway. Because at a certain level of success, the human mind begins to confuse confidence with infallibility. The voice that once said, "This is risky but possible," starts saying, "This is possible because I will it." That is not courage. That is not vision. That is hubris. And hubris, as the ancient Greeks understood with a clarity we have somehow forgotten, is not merely a personality flaw. It is a death sentence. Napoleon's empire fell not because his enemies were stronger, not because France was weak, not because fortune had simply turned. It fell because one man, at the absolute apex of his power, decided that the rules which governed lesser men did not apply to him. 600,000 soldiers paid for that decision with their lives, and an empire that had reshaped the world became a footnote. But here is the complicated truth, and history rarely gives us simple truths. Napoleon also left behind more than ruins. The Napoleonic Code still forms the legal backbone of over 80 nations. The metric system, championed under his reign, is used by nearly every country on earth. Modern concepts of meritocracy, centralized banking, and secular public education all advanced under his rule. He was simultaneously one of history's greatest builders and one of history's most cautionary tales. The ancient Greeks had a word, hubris, pride so extreme it becomes blindness. And they believed that hubris always attracted nemesis, not revenge exactly, but correction. The universe reasserting proportion. Russia was Napoleon's nemesis. Not because Russia was invincible, but because Napoleon had finally asked more of the world than the world could give. So the next time you're at the height of your power, whatever that means in your life, and someone you trust is trying to tell you something you don't want to hear, remember the snow. Remember the burning city no one surrendered. Remember 685,000 men who crossed a river in June, and the 100,000 shadows who crossed it back in December. History does not care about our certainty. It only remembers our choices. If this story moved you, share it. Subscribe if you want more films like this.